Heavy bombing resumes in what's left of rebel-held eastern Aleppo as the ceasefire breaks down. Thousands of people are trapped there with a planned evacuation for fighters and civilians now on hold. This morning's bombardment has been intense.
Good morning, my friends. The ceasefire agreed yesterday has been broken. Dozens of mortars are falling on besieged districts in Aleppo. The bombardment has left a number of injured who are being treated at makeshift hospitals.
It's not clear how many are still trapped in the Syrian city, but thousands of people, among them many children, have been trying to reach safety. From inside the city, one 7-year-old girl tweets in the last few minutes about intense bombing and asks, why is the world silent? We'll be hearing more from people trapped inside Aleppo, also this lunchtime. Former football coach Barry Bonnell is remanded in custody after appearing in court charged with child sex offences. £3 billion to be cut from school budgets in England by 2020, but the government insists standards will remain high. Trying to speed up smartphone internet connections, but the UK still lags behind Romania, Albania and Peru when it comes to 4G.
In the south, like a baby learning to walk again. The parents hope for 10-year-old Talia after a controversial operation. And how did he die? A wife calls for any witnesses to a fatal motorbike crash.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Eastern Aleppo is being pounded by more airstrikes and shells after a ceasefire to allow fighters and civilians to leave broke down. There's been more fierce fighting in what's left of the rebel-held part of the city, where it's thought tens of thousands of people, most of them civilians, are still trapped. Both sides have blamed each other for the new violence. Very few pictures have emerged from inside the city this morning, though a few people have managed to broadcast on social media and describe what's been happening there in the past few hours. From neighbouring Lebanon, Thomas Morgan reports.
The short-lived ceasefire in Aleppo shattered. The bombing and the battle resumes in the last rebel-held districts. Factions blame the regime for further fighting, whilst pro-government forces hold the opposition responsible.
Good morning, my friends. The ceasefire agreed yesterday has been broken. Dozens of mortars are falling on besieged districts in Aleppo. The bombardment has left a number of injured who are being treated at makeshift hospitals. The shelling is by the regime forces, backed by Iranian militias.
The evacuation that never was, transportation ready and waiting to move the tens of thousands, but it's reported that nobody left. The buses returning empty to the depot. The West to blame in the eyes of the president.
If we liberate Aleppo from the terrorists, there would be, the Western officials and the mainstream media, they're going to be worried about the civilians. They're not worried when the opposite happens, when the terrorists killing those civilians.
According to reports, both Russia and Iran need to agree on any deal before any evacuation and truce are held. The opposition say Iran want their own troops evacuated from other areas of Syria held by factions as part of any agreement. The regime believe rebels are on the brink of collapse.
I expect that the rebels will cease resistance in the next 2 or 3 days, and the minority that decides not to do so, it will be their own choice.
Those who can are fleeing, taking with them any and everything they can. But with the battle resuming, there is no chance of any aid reaching those trapped in besieged Aleppo.
What people in besieged eastern Aleppo need very much is a pause in the fighting, a durable pause in the fighting for us to be able to move in with humanitarian assistance.
Talks to bring an end to the fighting are continuing, according to the Turkish government. For now, the suffering for Aleppo goes on. Thomas Morgan, BBC News, Beirut.
Well, let's speak to our correspondent in Moscow, Sarah Rainsford. And Sarah, terrible scenes from inside Aleppo this morning. What is the response from Russia now that this ceasefire is clearly broken down?
Well, Russia is very clearly blaming rebel forces in eastern Aleppo for the breakdown of that ceasefire, not taking any of the responsibility itself, or indeed suggesting that Syrian government troops are to blame. Russia has said, the defense ministry here has said, that rebel forces began firing again, shelling the buses that were sent in to evacuate civilians, and that Syrian government forces responded. We've also heard from the Kremlin here, Dmitry Peskov, who's the spokesperson for Mr. Putin, who has denied that Syrian government troops are committing atrocities inside eastern Aleppo, and blaming that on what he calls, on what Russia calls, terrorists in eastern Aleppo, and saying that reports suggesting that are simply propaganda. Russia's very much portraying what's happening in Aleppo, in eastern Aleppo, as a liberation of the city there. And I think whilst there is diplomacy going on, Russia and Turkey are talking about trying to come to some sort of deal to make sure that this ceasefire is implemented and that people are evacuated. I do think Russia's fairly comfortable at the same time as with allowing Syrian government forces to press home the advantage and to continue with their efforts to take control over the whole of the city.
Sarah Rainsford in Moscow, thank you. Well, as the fighting continues to rage, residents of eastern Aleppo continue to try to flee the city. Already today, 15,000 people have attempted to escape the conflict, according to the Syrian government. But others have chosen to stay and have been describing what life is like inside the besieged city. Here's Richard Lister.
East Aleppo is a place of rubble and ruin and death. But almost unbelievably, there are still tens of thousands of people living as best they can in these shattered neighbourhoods. And every day, some are able to tell their stories. Like many in the city, Zahir Shamali had hoped yesterday's ceasefire would hold.
People were very bummed and were very frightened about this escalation that is taking place right now. And they think that the regime is going to take a ground force.
Okay, what's happened?
Yeah. It's just happening around here, and yes, the regime seems it's going to be taking a very close attacks, and maybe they will just have ground forces in the ground very soon as they are escalating the attacks.
We've also watched this war through the eyes of 7-year-old Bana Alabed. She tweeted yesterday, "This is my last moment to either live or die." Then there was silence. But today, another message from her mother, Fatima. What's happening now? Please help us now. No more time left. In the past few days, thousands more families have left East Aleppo. But as the fighting continues, thousands more are still trapped. Many of Aleppo's voices are parents, desperate to keep their children safe.
Really, I don't know what to say, but I hope I hope you can do something for Aleppo people, for my daughter, for the other children.
If they're injured, there is now hardly anywhere to take them. All of East Aleppo's hospitals have been wrecked by this war. For some of those tasked with treating the wounded or even burying the dead, there is a sense of hopelessness.
We couldn't help the injured people. We couldn't bury the dead bodies because of the situation, because of the bombing before the ceasefire. All of that because the whole war let us down.
And it's that sense of abandonment and isolation that comes through again and again.
It's really our last time, and we can't believe there's anyone on this planet could help us.
For those left in East Aleppo, all the talk of peace is still no more than just talk. Richard Lister, BBC News.
The rest of the news now, and the former Crewe football coach Barry Bennell has appeared in court charged with sex offences against a young boy. The 62-year-old appeared via a video link and was remanded in custody. Let's speak to our sports correspondent Andy Swiss, who's outside Crewe Magistrates Court. What happened in court, Andy?
Well, the hearing here at South Cheshire Magistrates Court lasted around 15 minutes. As you say, Barry Burnell didn't appear in person. Instead, he appeared via a video link wearing a blue jumper. He spoke only to confirm his name and his address, which was given as of no fixed abode. Now, Barry Burnell is 62 years old. He's a former football coach, a former youth coach with Crewe Alexandra. He's also worked for a number of other clubs across the northwest. He's been charged with 8 offences of sexual assault against a boy aged under 15. The offences are alleged to have happened between 1981 and 1985. It's claimed that one of the alleged offences happened at Butlins. The others are alleged to have happened at locations in Cheshire and Derbyshire. Barry Burnell has now been remanded in custody until next appear at Chester Crown Court on January the 11th. Sophie.
Thank you. The BBC has learned more details about how the government is going to raise extra money for social care in England. Let's speak to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's in Westminster. And we heard earlier this week about the care sector and people working in it saying that it was at tipping point. So what is the government now going to do?
Well, we get the full plans tomorrow, Sophie, but I think there's going to be an almighty row about them, because what's becoming clear is there is not going to be more money. Instead, local councils will be allowed to bring forward spending which they'd got penciled in for the next couple of years, increase that over the next 2 years, but then they'll have to recoup the money in the third year. So it's a sort of bit of financial jiggery-pokery to enable local councils to get through the immediate pressure on social care, but they'll have to claw back the money in year 3. Now, Jeremy Corbyn's already described that approach as a con. He called on the government to scrap its planned cuts in corporation tax to find the billions he believes are necessary to fund social care. And Sophie, there is, I think, a broad consensus across the parties here that social care is now in serious jeopardy, with the care sector suggesting something like 1 million elderly and disabled people are not receiving any adequate care. Suggestions the care sector could be short of around £1 billion this year. And there is a view that fundamental long-term reform and funding is now essential. Significantly, Mrs May pledged that, unlike other governments, she said hers would not duck the long-term decisions to make sure the system is adequately funded and sustainable. But here's the problem. To achieve long-term reform, you need 2 things. 1, money, which there clearly isn't, and 2, a political consensus, which there also clearly isn't.
Norman Smith in Westminster, thank you. And we're just going to go back now to our main story and the situation in Aleppo, in eastern Aleppo this morning. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is in neighbouring Lebanon, in Beirut. And Lise, it's incredibly difficult to establish exactly what is happening there. Very few pictures coming out of Aleppo this morning, though it is very clear that the bombardment is incredibly heavy.
Yes, it's clear that within hours of it being announced, the ceasefire was shattered, and in the midst of the resumption of airstrikes and shelling, heavy shelling is being reported on East Aleppo, and also rockets being fired into West Aleppo, the government-controlled area, or at least all of Aleppo is now government-controlled, but government supporters, rockets are being fired into that area as well. And this has meant, too, that the deal that took weeks to negotiate between the rebel fighters and Turkey and Russia, allies of either the Syrian government or the rebels, has now, at least it's been put on hold. This morning, the ambulances were there in the early hours of the morning in the dark. The green buses were there, ready to take out the fighters, ready to take out the wounded. But now, one of the many players in this very tangled war, Iran, which is one of President Assad's key backers, is saying no evacuation of fighters can take place unless there is a simultaneous evacuation of wounded fighters and civilians from a rebel-besieged area. So that is where it is now. Imagine the feeling, the emotions inside East Aleppo when they heard there was at last going to be a ceasefire, an end to the bombardment. And those who've been waiting for a medical evacuation, those including children who were waiting to be taken out, are being told, you have to wait another day, and the shelling, it will still continue. It's a great disappointment for all sides, but such is the uncertainty. and the continuing violence in a war that is Aleppo's.
Lise Doucette in Beirut, thank you. The time is coming up to 1:15, our top story this lunchtime. Fierce fighting resumes in Aleppo, dashing the hopes of thousands of civilians trying to escape the violence. And still to come, tackling the problem of homelessness. More than 3,500 people still sleep rough every night.
In South today, a little bit of sunshine, but will it last? We'll have the forecast. Also, how this barber has become one of the many victims of the rail strike. And goo goo gaga in French, Spanish and Mandarin, foreign language classes for babies.
Now, believe it or not, it is 8 years since 4G mobile phone access came to the UK, but there are still too many digital deserts and wireless not spots in our city centres, according to a report out today. The UK is lagging behind the likes of Romania, Albania and Peru when it comes to 4G access, with many mobile users still struggling to get a signal. The government's been warned that it must make sure the country is ready for 5G, the next generation of technology, or risk languishing in what it calls the digital slow lane. Here's our technology correspondent, Rory Jones.
You got me wrapped up around your finger, 'cause I'm up to my neck in Apple Music on EE.
This was the promise of 4G, seamless, super-fast mobile phone connections wherever you happen to be. But according to today's report, the reality has been much more patchy, and the UK now needs to get its act together.
The National Infrastructure Commission says that we need to see a target for dramatic improvements on our road and rail networks, which is one of the worst areas in terms of dropped calls and lack of connectivity at the moment. And the next generation of technology, 5G, we need to be prepared for so that we lead the world and we're not well behind.
The report says when it comes to 4G, the UK lags behind countries like Albania and Peru. So how did they work out we're so far behind other countries? Well, the report used data from this app, which people around the world use to check their mobile signal. Now, it has to be said, this may not be the best way to make international comparisons, but what is clear is that in the heart of UK cities, lots of people are still struggling to get a connection. By the end of next year, 98% of homes right across the UK are supposed to get indoor 4G coverage. But in Cardiff right now, people seem sceptical about that.
It's a big problem because when I'm working in different parts, nobody can get hold of me when I'm working down in Langum.
We live about 5 miles from here, and the signal is pretty intermittent. It is a frustration.
While they're still rolling out 4G, the mobile phone companies are now thinking about the next technology, 5G, which should be faster and more reliable. Today's report says the government must help develop the new networks, though some analysts are cautious.
Realistically, we're not going to get these technologies for another 5 or 6 years, probably if everything goes according to plan. Does it mean more speed? Is it better coverage? Is it a fatter data pipe? These are the sort of things that we need to work out, and it's great that the UK wants to be part of those ambitions, but let's first of all finish the job with 4G.
Mobile communications are changing the way we live and do business. If the UK falls behind in this vital technology, the impact on our economy could be severe. Rory Jones, BBC News.
The scale of the funding crisis facing England's schools is revealed today. Figures from the National Audit Office show schools are facing budget cuts of 8% and about 60% of secondary schools already have deficits. It says they'll need to find savings of £3 billion by 2020. Today, the government will say how the education budget is to be shared out, as our education correspondent Gillian Hargreaves now tells us.
The government pays £4,200 every year to educate him in West Sussex. But 22 miles away in Brighton, pupils at this comparable school have £260 more spent on them. Tunbridge House School has 1,500 pupils and has a budget of around £6 million a year. But it struggles to keep the books balanced because pupils here receive less money per child for their education than anywhere else in England.
Well, we're severely disadvantaged. My overall budget is around £600,000 less than the average and about £2.7 million less than the average London borough. In teaching terms, if I was funded just down the road, like an area in Brighton, I'd be able to employ around about 25 to 30 more teachers. If I were in Greenwich, that number would rise to about 80. I'd effectively be able to double my staffing.
Now, if we count them all up...
In an announcement today, the government said it wants a new national funding formula. The redistribution of cash would mean 10,000 schools getting more money.
The proposals for funding reform will mean that all schools and local areas will now receive a consistent and a fair share of the school's budget, so that they can have the best possible chance to give every child the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Even with fairer funding, the existing pot of money for schools is under huge pressure. A report published today by the National Audit Office says that funding isn't keeping pace with increased pupil numbers and the rising costs of national insurance and pension contributions. As a result, £3 billion worth of savings will have to be made by 2020. 60% of secondary schools will be in the red, with deficits averaging £326,000 per school.
It's great that we're going to have a better allocation of funding through a national funding formula, but we actually need more funding. That won't resolve the problem. That will just move the deck chairs around the Titanic, really.
The government says better funded areas will see their income drop, but none will face a cut of more than 1.5% each year to try to prevent more schools becoming financially unstable.
And Gillian is with me now. This idea of sharing out the money more fairly, it has taken a very long time to get to this point, hasn't it?
School funding is incredibly complicated, Sophie. 6 years ago, the then Education Secretary Michael Gove said he wanted to look at it and make it fairer. There are all sorts of historical anomalies. Take, for example, Nottingham. Nottingham City, children in the city receive £1,000 more per year for their schooling than children living in rural Nottinghamshire. So you may get the situation where two schools are only a few miles apart, but one child gets a lot more for their education than the other child, even though they may be in very similar circumstances. And there's a political point here, because a lot of the less well-funded areas have traditionally been in Tory shires, and a lot of Conservative councillors have said, we're running schools very well, and we just want a bigger slice of the pie to make it fairer. So today's announcement is giving them just that.
Gillian, thank you. The number of people out of work fell again between August and October. Official figures show unemployment went down by 16,000 to 1.62 million. They also show a rise in average weekly earnings, which rose 2.6% across the year. John Moylan reports.
The UK's job market has been buoyant for years, with big falls in unemployment matched by record numbers in work. But in recent months, the cracks have started to show. The labour market appears to be flattening out. In the 3 months to October, unemployment fell by 16,000, well down on the steep falls of the past. That kept the unemployment rate at 4.8%, still a 10-year low. But the numbers in work also fell by just 6,000 for the first time in over a year. So is the uncertainty around Brexit having an impact?
It's too early to say that. It's certainly true that because we are at such low levels of unemployment, that it's, I think, inevitable that the falls we'd seen in previous years are going to slow down or come to an end.
Betsy Ben is part of that job story. She works for herself, employing 8 people at her graphic design firm in Cheltenham. 15% of the UK's workforce is now self-employed. That's meant insecure, low-paid work for some, but a work-life balance for others.
It's all around the flexibility. When you've got a young family especially, and you want to watch them grow and raise them, then creating your own job, which allows you to create your own hours, gives you that flexibility while still providing a really great income.
Incomes matter, particularly at this time of the year. Figures yesterday showed a sharp rise in the cost of living. But for now, pay is still growing faster than inflation, rising at 2.6%.
Certainly, it's a welcome sight to see earnings growth picking up a bit from exceptionally low levels over the past year. What is not convincing yet is that if inflation continues to rise, as is likely over 2017, that companies are going to match that rise in inflation with pay increases.
If pay rises don't keep up next year, we'll all feel worse off. And with unemployment also expected to rise, 2017 could bring some real economic challenges. John Moylan, BBC News.
Union and management are meeting at the conciliation service ACAS this lunchtime to try to find a solution to the long-running dispute on southern trains. Well, let's speak to our transport correspondent, Richard Westcott, who's at Victoria Railway Station, and hundreds of thousands of rail users enduring a second day of disruption today. Any hope of a breakthrough?
Well, glimmers, I suppose. I wouldn't necessarily hold your breath to expect any kind of deal to be done today. We've got the strike today, there's no strike tomorrow, and then there's a strike on Friday. But I think tomorrow will be bad as well, because all the trains end up in the wrong places, so you can expect disruption for the rest of the week, effectively. So ASLEF, the drivers' union, the ones that are on strike today, they are currently still in talks with Southern. They're due to go on until about 3 o'clock. The other union involved in this dispute, the RMT, they look after most of the conductors. Well, their boss turned up to the talks today and was told, actually, we don't want you involved in these talks. We'll see you for talks at another time to talk about the conductors, but we don't want you there to talk about the drivers because you only represent 12 drivers. So a little bit of animosity there. Didn't really get things off to a good start. But the drivers' union are still there talking with the company. We don't really know what's going to come of this. As far as I can see from the outside, both sides seem to be still quite a way apart on the central issue of the role of this conductor on the trains. But we will see. We'll let you know as soon as we do.
Richard, thank you. Nicola Payne was 18 when she went missing in Coventry in 1991. Police believe she was abducted and murdered on her way to her parents' home, but her body was never found. Today, on the 25th anniversary of her disappearance, her parents are making a fresh appeal for information. Phil Mackey reports.
People say time heals, but not in our case anyway. It gets worse, doesn't it? You know.
The longer it goes on, yeah.
For a quarter of a century, John and Marilyn Payne have held out hope that they'll find their daughter Nicola's body and that her killers will be brought to justice.
I'll never give up hope that somebody out there will tell us where we can find her. I'll never give up. I'll always keep praying.
The 18-year-old had everything to live for. She had a young son, Owen, and was about to get married and move into a new house. She left her parents' home to walk to see her boyfriend, who lived 10 minutes away, then vanished. This was the last place that Nicola Payne was seen alive. Although it was the middle of the day like this, there was thick fog. Somebody did hear a scream. She was never seen alive again. It's presumed she was killed and her body was disposed of. Though within half an hour of her disappearing, the family had raised the alarm. They've been searching for her and for answers ever since. Hundreds of police officers were involved in the investigation. Over the years, numerous searches were carried out. This year they were at Coombe Abbey, just 3 miles away, which is where detectives now believe her body was taken.
I'm still hopeful that in the fullness of time we will find those answers for John and Marilyn and bring the people responsible for Nicola's abduction and murder to justice.
Last year, 2 men were acquitted after being tried for Nicola Payne's murder. And so her parents have to brace themselves for another anniversary with no answers. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Coventry.
It's thought that more than 3,500 people sleep rough every night, and that is just in England. Labour has called it a national shame and promised, if elected, to end homelessness within 5 years. And now Labour's calling on the Prime Minister to back its plans. Tim Muffet reports.
Woodland, west of London. For most, somewhere to walk or exercise. For Michael, it was home.
So this is where you were living in a tent for a year?
Yeah. Didn't want to live on the actual streets. I wanted to have some kind of, self-respect, you know, a bit of privacy.
Unable to afford proper accommodation, Michael would commute from these woods to his workplace.
My job was my escape. It just meant that I could use a proper toilet, get hot food.
According to the most recent government statistics, over 3,500 people sleep rough in England each night, a 30% rise in 1 year. Today, Labour said it would bring homelessness to an end within its first term of government. It would double the number of homes ring-fenced for those sleeping rough.
Good morning, Clearinghouse. Luke speaking.
The homelessness charity St Mungo's uses its clearinghouse scheme to help rough sleepers find accommodation.
Anything which focuses people's attention on the issues that rough sleepers are facing and provides some practical solutions to dealing with those has to be welcomed.
There are many reasons why people sleep rough. It's not necessarily just a lack of accommodation. Mental health problems, addiction, fear of domestic abuse, they can all play a part. So whilst some believe more homes would help, they won't on their own solve the problem.
What we can't do is spend all of the budget or just limit our spending on accommodation. We need it also for those mental health services, those GP services, and for training courses to make sure that young people can break that cycle of homelessness.
The government says rates of homelessness are now less than half of the peak seen in 2003, and that it's invested £500 million to help stop it.
This is my front room.
Michael has now found proper accommodation. He says his life's back on track. But for thousands of others, sleeping rough remains a nightly reality. Tim Muffet, BBC News.
Time for a look at the weather now with Matt Taylor, and it's sort of rather spring-like out there, isn't it?
Certainly is. A typical scene, in fact, across much of England, Wales, eastern Scotland out there this lunchtime. Sunshine and a bit of warmth after what's been a grey week so far. But we had the sunshine yesterday. It's a completely different shot. This was in Belfast earlier on and across western Scotland too. This is where we have the rain this afternoon, which isn't going to move a great deal. You notice we continue with sunny spells across much of England, Wales, eastern Scotland, and temperatures 14, maybe 15 degrees in one or two spots. So let's focus on that rain because it will be clearing away from Northern Ireland during the rest of today for a time. Still remains across Scotland, so Glasgow, Edinburgh, likes of Perth. It will be quite a damp rush hour with further outbreaks of rain. And some of that rain into the Isle of Man, also across Anglesey, Pembrokeshire and also Cornwall. But most are going to the night dry, some clear skies, but clouding over through the night. Mist, low cloud becomes dominant. A weather front just eases off to patchy rain or drizzle, some of it returning to Northern Ireland and southwest Scotland later. Not quite as mild as last night, but temperatures still above where they should be at around 6 to 10 degrees for many. But we're back to grey skies for the vast majority to start Thursday. Quite misty over the hills, a few fog patches here and there. Some of that low cloud will thin and break. Patchy rain or drizzle to go with it in the west, but here we will probably see the best of the sunnier breaks at times. And in Northern Ireland, western Scotland, a bit more sunshine to begin with compared with today, but Northern Ireland, the wet weather will return later on and temperatures down a notch on what we've seen through today. So we finish the day with wet and increasingly windy weather into Northern Ireland and eventually western Scotland. But like what we've seen at the moment, that weather front doesn't move a great deal. It just fizzles out as we go into Friday across the same sort of areas. Away from that, lots of misty grey low cloud once again, and patchy rain or drizzle, a bit of brightness coming through, best of which by the end of the day will be Scotland and Northern Ireland. And that's because as we finish the week, go into the weekend, we can say a welcome hello to high pressure. So most places dry into Saturday. There will be a legacy of low cloud across England and Wales, particularly gloomy and misty to begin with, and a little bit chillier than we've been used to this week so far. But the cloud will break up, sunny spells coming through, best of which is Scotland and Northern Ireland. But the breeze does pick up later here, and for Sunday, this is where the cloudiest weather will be. Some occasional rain, always bright across England and Wales once the morning mist and low cloud. And notice by the weekend, feeling that little bit more festive with temperatures around 7 or 8 degrees. Now, just before I go, if you're not a big fan of those dark nights and afternoons, these are the sunset times today, ranging from 5 to 3 in Lerwick to around 20 past 4 in Cornwall. The good news is, though, the nights are going to start to get that little bit shorter soon. Certainly the sunsets getting that little bit later.
Thank you. A reminder now of our main story this lunchtime. Fierce fighting erupts again in Aleppo as the ceasefire breaks down, with thousands of people still trapped in the Syrian city. That's all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me on BBC One. We now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.